have one more. We have Dr. Shatz now. Thank you. And no relation. Although the first time we met was in the elevator at the Hampton Inn here, when at the conference for Rambam's Bris. Thank you, everyone. Congratulations, Len. Congratulations, Phil. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Shatz. David Shatz is the Ronald P. Stanton University Professor of Philosophy, Ethics, and Religious Thought at Yeshiva University, and he was the first member of the various university faculties there to receive the Presidential Medallion. He has authored, edited, or co-edited many books, including most recently Judaism and the Philosophy of Religion, as well as over 100 articles and reviews dealing with both Jewish and general philosophy. He also has served as editor of the Torah Umara Journal and editor of a series devoted to unpublished manuscripts of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. A book devoted to his career, Shatz's career, and thought appears in the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers, a series that the publisher, Brill, states showcases outstanding Jewish thinkers who have made lasting contributions to constructive Jewish philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. Professor Shatz will be presenting on Rambam and the proper motivation for performing mitzvot. Please.
Dr. Shatz, you're muted.
Yeah, what I said is that thank you very much for the introduction. I couldn't come in person because I was sick and I still have a residue of a problem with my voice, coughing somewhat. So please excuse that. I want to join all those who commended the translation. I mean, been having to do the whole book, the whole project, and I hope that there'll be ample opportunity over the years to keep updating the notes. I saw how helpful the notes are. I was reminded of something Bertrand Russell said about a certain technique in math, I think, that will enable you to do something quickly. And he said it has all the advantages of theft over honest toil. And I think that that's true when you use these notes. I also noticed that Zev Harvey is on the Zoom, and I have to say that I pestered him and Joseph Stern with a lot of questions they're going to be posing here. So anyway, so any mistakes, of course, are completely their fault. Maimonides takes an important position about the proper motivation for performing mitzvot, namely that mitzvot should be performed without ulterior motivation. However, some of his views on the topic are somewhat unclear and even, surprise, surprise, contradictory. In this paper, I try to execute some sorting of sources and models connecting the issues to various topics like reasons for the commandments. Now, my aim here is not to, as I used to say in the base medrash, slug up, in other words, to refute Rambam, but instead I want to call attention to certain parts of his discussions that can aptly be called fault lines or pockets of inconsistency. Time is too short to go through the entire dialectic, nor do I have a full dialectic worked out for all the points I'm going to make. The one point I want to make is that the discussion of motivations, which occupies so much space in the legal writings, is not a topic in the guide. Instead, something else happens with the question of something that replaces the topic of motivations when you get to the guide. So I'm going to go through that. The first thing I'd like you to do, though, if you have the source sheets, do you have them yet? Micah gave them out. Thank you very much. I think when you do Rambam's legal writings, it's good to start with the rabbinic material that he had available to him. So there is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Antigonus of Socho said in the name of Simon the Righteous, "Do not be like servants who serve the master for the sake of receiving reward, avodim hamishamshin es arabo manas l'kabel pras, but rather like servants who serve the master not for the sake of receiving reward." And the awe of heaven, I put awe in brackets because fear sort of connotes something other than an opposition to ulterior motivation. So Antigonus' position is no ulterior motivation. This does not mean that Antigonus does not believe in an afterlife or in rewards in the afterlife. That's made clear in passage about the Rabbi Natan. And in addition, it also doesn't suggest that the mitzvahs have no reasons. What it means is you should be like an Eved, okay? Doing it for a reason is not the way of an Eved. Now it's interesting, there's a second Mishnah of the name of Rebbe which actually affirms ulterior motivation, which is very surprising. In other words, you weigh the benefits and the harms that will come to you, rewards and punishments, as you act. And Barbanel makes an interesting point about this because it seems so counterintuitive to allow people such selfish considerations. Barbanel says, look, if you do things lishma, if you do things without an ulterior motive, then what happens to reward and punishment? In other words, your belief in reward and punishment comes unexpressed. He makes this point about Rambam too. I think Rambam could have an answer to that, but it's an interesting point that can drive the other side. Of course, a lot of commentators on Pirkei Avot like to harmonize different views, say that, hey, he's not the ideal, Antigonus is the ideal, and they go together. But in any case, it's interesting that there's opposition. The third source is number 3, the Talmud in Psachim 50b. A man ought always to labor in the Torah, even if not for its own sake, but by doing it not for its own sake, he may come to do it for its own sake. Lishma and lo lishma. Lishma meaning not for its own sake, and lo lishma meaning not for its own sake, and lishma meaning for its own sake. Now, what I want to ask first, I think what I want to ask next to is just look at Rambam quickly. There's source 5 is from the commentary to the Mishnah. It's probably the most important source in this discussion, where he talks about what motivates people to study Torah. And he gives an example. You have a teacher teaching a child and offers the child figs and nuts. That seemed to be the menu in those days. And then give him a dinar or two, or dinner for two, whatever it is. And then people also, when they grow up and they want to be a judge, or they want to be a president, or they want to be, a leader of some sort. So Rambam sees these as kind of continuum. In other words, if you whether it's food or it's money or it's honor, that's what people want. And here is the passage in which he says, number 5, now all of this, studying Torah and doing mitzvot from ulterior motives, is deplorable. However, it's unavoidable because of man's limited insight. In other words, people are naturally going to head in that direction. But he says, next sentence, our sages call this learning not for its own sake, lo lishma. The truth has no other purpose, no other purpose than knowing that it is truth. Truth has no other purpose other than knowing its truth. One should believe the truth for the sake of the truth. Now, it's not that easy to figure out what this means. F. already pointed out that God could be called emet in this context. It's a hard locution, and I'm not going to bother to read the Hebrew in Shilat, but it really gives you this idea that it's really, completely, really for its own sake. And in addition to that source, you have, skip a bit to 7, and then I can work back to 6. 7 is from the Mishnah Torah. Hilchos Tshuva, the last chapter of Hilchos Tshuva, last chapter of Sefer Hamadah. Let not a man say, I will observe the mitzvahs of the Torah and occupy myself with its wisdom, in order that I may obtain all the blessings written in the Torah, or to attain life in the world to come. Whoever serves God out of love, Ahava, occupies himself, which he mentions also in Chelek, occupies himself with the study of Torah and the fulfillment of commandments, and walks in the ways of wisdom, impelled by no external motive whatsoever, moved neither by fear of calamity nor by the desire to obtain material benefits. Such a man does what is truly right, because it is truly right. The same kind of phrasing that you have in the Hakdamah Chelek. Now I want to pose a few questions about this, okay? The most straightforward problem, I think, is that the English terms, for its own sake, not for its own sake, I don't think that they work very well. Now, as I go through my examples, you might think, oh, the answer to that is obvious, but it may be, but I want to go through it anyway. The first thing I want to make clear is that I'm speaking about motives for observing the law. I'm not speaking about whether there are reasons for the law. For example, in Guide 331, Rambam considers a group of people who think that reasons should not be given for any law. And in that chapter, he cites the pasuk, "L'tov lanu kol hayamim l'chayotenu kayom hazeh," that the purpose of the Torah is to bestow upon us good in order to keep us alive to this day. Now, is he in that way, by appealing to L'tov lanu, is he sanctioning ulterior motives? No, he's not sanctioning ulterior motives. He's describing a benefit. You clearly have to distinguish between a reason that a legislator has, like God, for legislating the mitzvah, and X being a motivator for the performer to do good. God is wise, God is good, and therefore God bestows the benefit by giving you the mitzvah to do. But the benefit isn't ipso facto proper motivation. Now, you could play around with this. I'm going to get to this possibility in a little while, and that is, well, the Tov Lanu and the Chayotenu refers to, let's say, intellectual perfection, which is an ulterior motive Rambam would be fine with, but let's wait to see. Okay. Now, there are other examples of proper motivation. One of them, which I have here on the sheet, but I'm not going to take the time to go through it, has to do with a passage in which he says that the problem with people is that when they think of what's delightful or what's bliss, okay, they think of material delights. But there are these spiritual delights. In fact, these spiritual delights are so great that we're not even in a position now, when we're embodied, certainly, to know what they are. My question is, suppose that a person undertakes to do the mitzvah for those spiritual benefits. I mean, is that considered lo lishma? After all, it fits technically the description of not for its own sake. Okay, that's the question. That's what I'm zeroing in on. It's the expression not for its own sake and for its own sake. And now let me get to others. I think I know what you're thinking, but let me go to it anyway. Guide 354, which is on page 2. 354 is the chapter in which he talks about what is human perfection. Now, here's what he says about the third perfection. The third type graces one personally more than the second. This attainment is moral, perfecting the virtues of character in oneself. Most of the mitzvot serve just this end, but even this is a stepping stone to a higher goal. Tell me, does that say you're doing the mitzvot for their own sake, or you're doing it to something on a higher level? For its own sake doesn't seem to fit here. There's an interesting comment that Barbanel makes in his Commentaries of Avot, that the phrasing of this concept came from Aristotle, from Nicomachean Ethics, where you sort of end the infinite regress by saying there's something that's good in itself. But anyway, Rambam does not here. He's not saying that doing the mitzvot is good in itself. So then let's go to 354, where you get to the fourth kind of perfection. The fourth perfection is the truly human attainment, winning the intellectual virtues, the conceptual thinking that yields sound views of deity. That's our highest goal. Truly perfecting the self, an attainment indeed one's own, winning immortality by fulfilling in oneself what makes a human human. Now, suppose that I read this chapter and I want to know what's human perfection. And I say, well, human perfection is intellectual perfection. Yeah, I mean, why is that? What am I going to get out of that? Well, Rambam's giving us the answer, because it's going to lead to something else. You fulfill in yourself what makes a human human. You fulfill your humanity. So in both the third perfection and the fourth perfection, the actual perfection is leading to something else. I mean, the way the Rambam lays it out, the reason you should aim at number 4 is immortality and becoming human. Now, of course, you can distinguish, I know this, between proper and improper motivation. This is what I was referring to. In other words, you might say that certain kinds of motivations are fine, certain motivations are far from fine. Super Bowl tickets, that's not fine. Knowledge, yes. Then you might say that's really what he's talking about. In fact, when you look at the passages I read, he's always attaching it to some material benefit that he thinks is not important. But I would say this, that for its own sake doesn't capture what Rambam wants to say. Now you might say, well, let's try something else. He says in Mishnah Torah, Ahava, love of God. The problem is that both in the Mishnah Torah and in the introduction to Chelek, he links Ahava to doing things for their own sake. So if there's a problem with the concept of doing it for their own sake, you're not going to rescue it by saying, let's substitute Ahava for the notion of for its own sake. What I think is happening here is that in Talmud Chelek and Hilchos Tshuva, I think Rambam is criticizing a certain structure of acting, means, ends. He criticizes it in those terms, that you should never do it for an end. But it's not true. He allows many things to be done for some other end. His real beef is with the content of certain ends, money, honor, etc. Now, all in all, it's possible that Rambam may have later abandoned the idea, this focus on Lishma, Lo Lishma, and I'll get to that a little later. He doesn't go back to it in the guide, and I'd like to think it's because he read my paper, but I don't think that's what happened. Now, I want to raise here another question, and that is, sorry, that difficult phrase, Oseho Emet, Mipnei Shehu Emet. I mean, what does that mean? First of all, it's odd grammatically. What do you mean you do the truth? I think basically, however you want to parse that, I think the phrase can be understood in two ways. I think it should be understood, let's just work with this, that what it means is you do the right because it's right. But that can mean two things. On the one hand, it can mean that you should do it because God commanded it. On a second reading, you should do it for the reason that God commanded it. The Tam HaMitzvah. That makes it the right thing to do. In other words, on the first view, you simply obey the commandment heteronomously. On the second view, the second interpretation of the Emet Mipnei Shehu Emet, you understand that this mitzvah is rational, and you therefore act on the mitzvah. So is this a heteronomous stance that he's advising, or is it a stance in which you recognize the force and the validity, and the force and the validity of the reasons? Now, I think we usually think that it should be the latter, that it should be, the sort of rational approach. Because, you want to say, well, Rambam wanted to sensitize people to the rationality of mitzvot. But at times, he seems to interpret Oseho Emet Mipnei Shehu Emet by using heteronomous terms. And we're going to go through these examples. I have to say, some of these examples have been pushed back, not because of my question, because of other questions, by Joseph Stern, who sees more of an esoteric layer here. So let me just lay out what's on the table. The first is what I read before, the statement in Chelek that the truth has no purpose other than knowing that it is truth. One should believe the truth for the sake of truth. That sounds to me heteronomous. Then he quotes next a quotation of Antigonus. You read Antigonus. Antigonus looks heteronomous. This is the point that Abarbanel, again in his commentary to Avot 1.3, Abarbanel makes this point. He says, what kind of thing is this? He's using an image of an Eved, that's Antigonus, and what's happening is Maimonides is taking this to be something other than what it is. So Antigonus means this heteronomously. Now, Rambam mentions, and others can accept this too, that because the masses are not able to act heteronomously, they need some reward. So therefore, Rambam took this latest statement in Pirkei Avot Chachamim Hizaharu b'Devreichem, that the wise people should be careful about what they say. Rambam applied that to Antigonus. Okay, but Antigonus himself seems to be espousing something heteronomous. Now, there are also a surprising number of places, and here's where Joseph Stern's work comes in. One is the phrase Gzerat HaKotuv, which appears 9 times in the Mishnah Torah. And if it's Gzerat HaKotuv, that means that he's getting the masses to be motivated by the fact that it's a command. Now, Joseph points out that in these places there could be, some reason, and he itemizes them, reasons why the masses should not know that there really is a reason. But he's allowing here the masses of people not to have a reason at all, which is really, different from telling them to do it because of reward. So in one sense, he takes them away from reward. On the other hand, it's a decree. The word Gzeirah, by the way, is interpreted in different ways. For example, Nachmanides understands it to mean a decree of the king that's done for the benefit of the people, as opposed to some arbitrary fiat. So that could figure in here. Another thing is, and here Len comes in, Len's done work on 326, which is where Rambam asks about the particulars of the mitzvah, or what Len and Phil call the specifics of the mitzvah. So, for example, there's a reason for bringing sacrifices, but there might not be, a reason for bringing a particular animal. As the Len will put it, the specifics are to be ascribed to God's will. Now, what Rambam argues there is that rationality sometimes requires that you have no reasons. So when the performer chooses a particular animal, that choice would have to be made heteronomously. I mean, it seems that it doesn't make sense. He has to obey the legislator's command. God seems to be picking that arbitrarily, simply because an arbitrary choice has to be made. I mean, you go to a store and you want to buy a can of soup under a particular brand, and they have 50 of them. You just pick one. And Sidney Morgenbesser and Edna Ullman Margalit wrote a paper where they had terminology picking versus choosing. In medieval times, they had different terminology. I think this is very good. To choose is to choose something on the basis of seeing which alternative is better. To pick is a choice. We just have to pick. Sometimes you have to pick. There's an emergency outside your house, so you grab a coat and you put it on. You don't really care whether it matches your shoes. I mean, there are various kinds of situations in which you pick rather than choose. Now, again, I mean, Len has a very subtle approach to this. Joseph writes about it too, but I'm just pointing out that these are things that have to be on the table when you're discussing Rambam's motivation. Another is a statement that he quotes in Shmona Prakim, where he quotes a midrash that says, a person should not say, I desire to eat pork, I'm sorry, I don't desire to eat pork, because I can't stand the taste of pork, or I can't stand this woman who I might have relations with, I don't want to have relations with her. You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say, I want to do it, but I won't do it. Why? God has decreed it. Now, there is a reason why God, has decreed it. It has to do with self-discipline, learning self-discipline. But again, it doesn't come off that way. It comes off that this is just something someone should do heteronomously. It's a Kantian position. When Kant says, in conquering your inclinations, then your act has more moral worth when it follows your inclinations. And so what I'm saying here is a kind of second problem. The first problem was that the words for its own sake don't really fit what Rambam is after. And the second problem here is that, which I'm raising here, is that there are these statements that seem geared toward a heteronomous stance, in which case Oseh Ahmed would mean simply, you subjugate yourself. I'm sorry, I said it's a problem. I don't think it's a problem. It's an observation. Let's call it an observation. Finally, I get to the third part. The third part is about the guide. And one thing I mentioned is that the guide does not have much on this. I don't think Lishma and Lo Lishma appears there. They cut out the two people here, and he does things differently. And I think basically, I would say the commandments do not function here, but the importance is not, sorry, it's not motivation. What is important in the guide? I think it's a different word, appreciation. And let me explain what I mean. In guide 25 to 49, and here I'll read a little bit, because this is one part that I actually wrote out a little. In the guide 25 to 49, especially 27 to 49, Rambam ties the chukim largely to explaining that this or that mitzvah is either a direct counter to the ways of idol worship or an accommodation, later like you have in Korbanot. The Sabaean explanations, now the Sabaeans are the group he thought was having these practices. My understanding is, Dennis says this in the footnote, I don't remember, Len, if you discussed, Len, Phil, if you discussed this, but that Rambam was relying on a forgery. In other words, this was a fictional presentation, but based on the fictional presentation, he looked historically, he looked at the mitzvot as a counter to the Sabaeans. In other words, knowing history of the ancient Near East enables you to figure out why the mitzvot were given. Now, the Sabaean type explanations don't seem to be motivators for the performer, because remember, the mitzvot in question were no longer observed in the absence of a temple. They're not motivations for us today. Instead, there are ways, or what is it? Ways of appreciating, by studying the Sabaean history, the ways of appreciating the legislators, God's wisdom. Here is a quotation from 349 from the translation. See how wonderfully wise God's laws are. As wondrously wise as his works. It says, the rock whose work is perfect. Hatsur tamim pa'alo. All his ways are justice. Just as his works are consummately perfect, continuing the quotation, his commandments are consummately just. And I thought we got to give you the source sheet that has this quotation in there. Let's see what else I'll need. Hang on a second. Yeah. Okay. Now, that was quotation 11. Now, there's a parallel, and it exists elsewhere in Rambam, between laws of nature and Torah laws, two types of law. Just as one has reasons, so does the other. Both reflect Hatsur Tamim Pa'alo, okay, God's perfection. See how wondrously wise that is a reaction to the wisdom of the mitzvah. It's not a reason, it's not given as a reason to do the mitzvah. Now I saw that line somewhere, and I don't remember where I saw it, so someone else actually said it first. Namely, in mitzvot that are no longer practice. It's not a reason to do that mitzvah. Looking back at ancient times with knowledge of the Near East enables you to appreciate God's wisdom. So love of God can be attained through studying these reasons, as long as one studies them in conjunction with knowledge of the teleology of God's laws. As if you understand God gave these laws for this reason back in the Sabaean times, then you will appreciate them and you'll understand God's wisdom. Now in Mishnah Torah chapter 2, you may know, he also talks about God's wisdom leading to love, but that's in connection with natural law, laws of nature. And that's said again in Hilchot Teshuvah, but that's also in conjunction with science or laws of nature. Here, he seems to be talking about both, the whole of being as a whole. It's a phrase from 328. So, what's happening here is that I think that this makes the discussion, I think in this discussion, motivations give way, or they take a back seat to this question of appreciation. Motivation versus appreciation. Sefer HaMitzvot, look at number 10. I have to say there's a lot of good stuff on this. Don Seaman, Joseph Stern, others. Number 10, Sefer HaMitzvot, positive commandment 3, which in a sense says it all. This is the way Don Seaman frames his whole paper. We are commanded to love God, that is, to dwell upon and contemplate his commandments, injunctions, and works. Okay, commandments, what injunctions are, is open to question, and works. The works meaning the works of nature. So that we may attain a conception of him and absolute joy. As the phrase says, you should love the Lord your God, and then he goes on to talk about love of God. This phrase gives the Sefer HaMitzvot gives the essence of what Rambam is doing at the end of the guide. he is telling you that God's wisdom is manifest in two ways. Again, it's not about motivation. This is about appreciation. The final leg of this talk, I mean, I'm on my last legs here, has to do with the shift that seems to take place in Guide 351. And I want to look at this quote in light of some of the things we said. I think I kind of rushed things. Let's take a look here at source 12. All our devotional practices, then you'll find an analog to this in 344, but it's more specific in 344. All our devotional practices, reading the Torah, praying, and performing the other mitzvot, aim only to train us to focus on his precepts and free us from worldly distractions, engrossed, as it were, in him and lost to all else. The idea behind the mitzvot is that you occupy yourself with the mitzvot. By occupying yourself with the mitzvot, you're detaching yourself from other human interests. If you pray by just moving your lips, facing the wall, but thinking of buying and selling, or your tongue reads the Torah, but your heart is on building your house, oblivious to what you were reading, that's deliciously ambiguous, because what you were reading is an anthropomorphic description in the Torah. But let's put that aside. When you perform any commandment with your limbs only, as if digging a hole in the ground or cutting wood in the forest, Joseph Stern, again, has a long chapter on this, disregarding the meaning of the act and its object and author. Okay, disregarding the meaning of the act and its author, do not think that you have fulfilled a commandment. You would be like those of whom it says, these quotes this elsewhere, thou art near to their mouths, but are far from their reins. Now, it also in but here's 344, the object of all these rites is constant mindfulness of God. So the idea here is that sort of at the ultimate stage, what are you at the ultimate stage, what are you doing? Well, you no longer, supposedly a person at that stage has probably reached the ethical and the intellectual perfections. So now there's a question, and the question is antinomianism. He might say, look, I got to the top of the ladder, what else can I do? I have an example here of my own. Suppose I teach my child how to catch a ball by teaching him the art of juggling several balls at once. By that practice, he then learns to catch a single ball very well. Suppose he eventually no longer needs juggling and can catch a ball without doing juggling during practice. He can love me for what I taught him and consider me wise because of my teaching technique, but that doesn't give him a reason to juggle. So the question then I think Rambam is addressing here, and others argue similarly, is what do you do with the philosopher who reaches this highest level? And the philosopher here would have a reason to continue, and it's clear, I think, from the passage that would also be his motive. There, his motive should be to continue to divest himself of material pursuits. Okay, I better wrap this up, so let me just say the following. Yeshaya Leibovitz is said to have said, religion is not God serving man, but man serving God. I say is said to have said because I asked several people, where does he say it? The answer came back, so it was sort of like something I saw once in the Journal of Philosophy. He says it everywhere in his writings, but nowhere in particular. Okay, that's his overall view. He claims that Maimonides agrees with this statement. Now, he's half right, I think. God serves man by his wisdom in nature and in Torah. And as Menachem wrote, when you get to the question of man serving God, Menachem wrote, it is a religion of challenges, not endowments, of demands, not bequests. And my apologies to Menachem for not taking a breath between mentioning Leibovitz and mentioning him. But man must serve God, and I've discussed some of the complexities of that concept. Okay. Zehu. Okay.
Dr. Kellner had to run to an appointment, so I am filling in for the Q&A session. So thank you so much, Professor Shatz, for that wonderful exploration of motivation and reasons for the commandments. Now I would like to invite anyone who has questions or comments. Perhaps it's best to approach the microphone, as we learned from last time. I can ask one question just to begin. At the beginning of the talk, you quoted various rabbinic sources that use the term neshama. I'm also wondering if you think that rabbinic discussions of kavanah and the role that kavanah or proper intention plays in the performance are hovering in the background here of this kind of triangulation of motivation and tam or tam mitzvot.
Right. That question it occurred to me, and I didn't pursue it. I think it's a very good question. I think that the last quotation I had, from 351 of this idea of this completely disinterested worship, we focus only on God, could be characterized as kavanah. But I really haven't worked out anything, anything beyond that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, because it does. I think it does relate. I just didn't work through how it might, and in a fuller. I was going to say this is a work in progress, but usually work in progress means that I'm stymied at a certain point. So that's where I am. But thank you for that question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it reinforces my idea that it's something I should pursue. How's that for evasion? Evasion.
Other comments, questions? Professor Good.
That was a very rich talk, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to reading it in its entirety. I'm fascinated by your reference to heteronomy and autonomy, uh, Kantian themes, which are very universal. Uh, I think I I think I think what we need to think about uh, the rabbinic sources. Okay. Um, he should turn off his for a minute and then turn it on again.
Yeah, Professor Schatz, do you mind just muting for a
Because it's creating it.
What, my audio? I mean,
Yeah, just mute it for a moment. Yeah, I still see you. Yeah, wonderful. I think the connection between autonomy and heteronomy is very important. It's a great theme that Kant makes an important point about, and you can see it resolved in a way in the rabbinic uh, tradition in a very Aristotelian way. Well, if you start out doing something not for an intrinsic reason, but for an extrinsic reason, there's an educational process. There's a process of moral self-training by which one might come to do it ultimately for an intrinsic reason. That's reflected even in the stages of Kohlberg's discussion of human moral development. The little kid first imitates and then internalizes the rule, and eventually does it because of seeing the intrinsic value of that adherence to a principle, not really just to a behavioral way of operating. I guess my question is about the possible worry that's a very Maimonidean worry in a way that you're going to be pursuing bliss, even in a spiritual way, rather than the intrinsic value of the mitzvot themselves. And I raise that in particular in regard to Maimonides' treatment of the virtues as means to an end. He thinks that the virtues are means to human self-perfection, and in that sense, obeying the mitzvot, most of which he believes are connected with improving our character, to make yourself a better person, is not doing the actions that are commanded by the mitzvot or refraining from the actions that are forbidden by them, is not doing them for their own sake, but it's doing them in order to become a better person, to become Isn't that an extrinsic goal as well? As he says at the end of the guide, these are the ones that really involve making yourself better, improving, perfecting yourself. The real goal is to become more human and thus more godlike. Why is that lishma somehow? The actions themselves are not done for their own sake, but they're done for the virtue, for the better person that you want to become. You can turn it on again so we can hear you.
Okay, first, as I mentioned, I think that from the idea of these lishma, lishma, and as I said, I'd like to think is for the reasons that I gave, that he does countenance certain means ends, certain means ends ideas. If you wanted to make a case, though, that for spiritual benefits being, somehow okay in terms of means ends, or a case for individual perfection being that way, I think the word that came to mind as I was working in an earlier version of this was the word constitutive. In other words, the spiritual delights are constitutive of the spiritual of the mitzvot. You do the mitzvot, you're getting these benefits, but the benefits are sort of not outside you in some sense. Now, in the case of the fourth perfection, what occurred to me is that it might be as follows. It's not that, and this sort of undercuts a little of what I said before. It's not that by having knowledge you're saying, okay, I want to get immortality, I want to be human, or I want to perfect myself. It's that in attaining intellectual perfection, you are improving yourself, or you are moving toward immortality. I think that's the difference. In other words, you sort of make the goal constitutive in the activity. But I don't think Rambam really at this point, I don't think he had any, quote, motivation, motivation to do this. I don't think, I don't think he was concerned anymore with the rabbinic question. Of course, if it turns out that there's somewhere in there he talks about it, that's something else. But if he doesn't mention Lishma, I don't know if we really have to give an answer. I do think you're right that, as I said, that what is driving him, I think, is simply the idea that there are intrinsic motivators and extrinsic. So I've sort of tried to show, I don't think that distinction can be drawn. So I think that the only way to draw the distinction is to come out and say what you have in mind. What are proper motivations, what are improper motivations. It's what I call, philosophy, give the denotation of the term, not the connotation, or the extension of the term and not the, intention with an S of the term. I think that's sort of the way to go. Let me mention one other thing that I, deliberately left out for time considerations, but once I'm here, one of the issues that comes up with respect to the Rambam, and there's a lot of literature on it, a lot of people reacted to this, is where he says, despite the fact that the Gemara, one Gemara at least, says that if you say, I want to do this to achieve Olam Haba, that's fine, Harezat Sadiq or more. In contrast with that, the Rambam says that if you set up for yourself, and it was within what I had here, that even if you have the world to come, Olam Haba, as your goal, okay, it's easy to say, I'm doing this to achieve Olam Haba. Even that's wrong. Now, this is very hard to understand, and there's a way out of it, but I think on its surface, quite a number of people have pointed out that Olam Haba for the Rambam is not this, this place in the next, in the next world. Leibovitz was once asked about Olam Haba, and he said, Olam Haba is a musag geography. He said, it's a place, and that if you think but for Rambam, Olam Haba is something you can live even while you're in your body. In other words, it's a certain orientation. David Hartman stresses this, for example. You're in your body. So what is terrible? What is so bad about achieving Olam Haba? About aiming to achieve Olam Haba. There, I think the reason has to do simply what Olam Haba means. I don't think he's referring to his fancy concept of Olam Haba. He's got to be referring to some lower, more primitive, more masses-like concept of Olam Haba. Anyway, so the answer to your question, though, I think is that he could go that way, but I don't think he's inclined to go that way in the guide. I mean, he's just inclined to say if the aim is the aim of moral virtue is to achieve knowledge, that's fine. I don't care if it means ends. I don't care if it's in that sense lo lishma. Okay, but thanks for the question.
Great. We have a question on Zoom from Professor Harvey.
Oh, good. Okay. Supposedly you're a friend. I wonder what what's already. Yeah. Let me mute myself.
Professor Harvey, you have to unmute.
Your observation, I get it in my hand here too. Your observation that lishma and lo lishma, the discussion of lishma and lo lishma does not appear in the Guide of the Perplexed, I think is an extremely important observation, especially if we consider what goes on in Sefer Hamadah. Sefer Hamadah is one of the most original things that Maimonides wrote, the Book of Knowledge. And one of the revolutionary things in Sefer Hamadah is the way he concludes it. He has a completely new definition of tshuva, which is nothing like the definition of tshuva which he had in his commentary on the Mishnah and in his Sefer HaMitzvot. A completely new reorganization of what the foundation beliefs of Judaism are. And he concludes it with a discussion of lishma, a resounding definition, which is climactic and dramatic and means this is what Torah is all about. And it's amazing that it doesn't exist in the Guide of the Perplexed. Leibovich, who you mentioned several times, turned the lishma, Maimonides' notion of lishma, into a basic part of his own interpretation of Judaism. And if there were a place in the Guide of the Perplexed where Maimonides discussed lishma and lo lishma, Leibovich would have found it. The closest thing he found was that sentence that you quoted from Guide of the Perplexed 351, where one does the mitzvot in order to do the mitzvot. But there, he's really talking about targil or riada. He's not talking about lishma or lo lishma. So there's really no place in the guide where one can say the most important idea in the Book of Knowledge appears, and it doesn't. So I think this is absolutely amazing, and I think it really calls for further thought of what's going on, what's going on. But I want to thank you very much for this presentation.
Hey, well, thank you for your haskama, your endorsement. Thank you.